Thank you, Stephen. And thanks for all that you've done to get this day together. We'll be talking basically about articles that have been published in this Journal of Contemporary Ministry, this latest version, and it's four of the contributors who will be speaking about that. Can I just pay tribute to John Newton, who was the person who got this journal started in 2015, I think it was. And together I've worked with him on the journal and a number of editions. And I think it's produced a lot of very useful materials over time. It's been a good way for people to produce the work that they're doing in ministry. It was originally designed for people doing doctorates of ministry and give them opportunity to share the work that they were doing, so that the whole church can think about its ministry. It's academic, but it's also very much something for people within the churches, and our dream was that it would be read and used by thinking leaders within the churches as well. The theme of this particular version, this particular edition of it, is religion and society. In early human societies, as I see it, I don't think there was a division between religion and society. People felt that they lived in a world where there were many invisible forces and powers, and they assumed that those forces and powers were similar to some of the powers that they had themselves as human beings, only greater. So the source of those forces and powers must be human-like, only much more powerful. And they called on those powers and sought to beg or manipulate things in order that they might be successful in hunting or in struggling with a neighbouring power. And in this sort of world, the leaders and elders usually were also the people who were connected to those powers. As societies became more complex, people, of course, began to take on special roles. And some people were seen as specialists in connecting with these non-human powers, such as shamans. When human settlement occurred, there were shrines where people could go to connect with them, priests to officiate at ceremonies and rituals. With further division of roles and responsibilities in society, religious specialists became distinct from the political specialists. And that involved a major social change. And we see this recorded in the Bible, as Samuel bowed to pressure and appointed the first king of Israel about 3,000 years ago. Over the following centuries, religious leaders emerged who began to develop moral codes that were not just about begging or manipulating the gods, but were better ways of living in society, ways that the gods would approve. And these religious leaders also founded schools of their disciples. And a period that's fascinated me has been that period around 600 to 500 years before the Christian era, when this process was happening in many parts of the world. In Persia, Zoroaster led the way and had a great influence on kings such as King Cyrus, who, of course, as you will know, is noted in the Bible as one of the anointed ones, even though he does not know me, says Yahweh in the book of Isaiah. In China, Confucius and Lao Tzu were both building their own philosophical and religious beliefs and practices. In India, Sautama Gautama was making major changes to Hinduism, which led to the development of Buddhism. In Greece, Socrates and Plato were providing a moral basis for Greek society. In Israel, Jeremiah and the Isaiah prophetic school was developing, playing major roles in the development of the Jewish faith. And all of these great prophetic figures lived within about 100 years of each other, a period often referred to now from the time of Jaspers as the axial age. In each place, these religious leaders gave shape to religious institutions which were separate from the political powers and had the ability to provide some form of critique of the political powers. The religions began to transcend political boundaries and gradually became universalized. And for Judaism, this, of course, occurred with the teaching of Jesus and then Paul. But there's been many times in history when the religious institutions have overreached. One fascinating example I've been looking at recently is in 14th century England, the time the church was very powerful and owned a great deal of land in England, which meant significant oppression of those who worked the land. And in 1209, King John seized all the lands that were owned by the church. In response, he was excommunicated by the Pope, and some while later, King John capitulated and returned those lands. The Pope also wanted some compensation for the trouble that he'd gone to. And that actually was one of the incidences that led to the rise of John Wycliffe, who was asked by the King of England to go and have a discussion with the Pope. Wycliffe argued that temporal authority and spiritual authority should be kept separate. And if you had spiritual authority as the Pope, then you shouldn't have temporal authority. The Pope didn't quite buy the argument. In general, however, it seems to me that the civil powers have sought to co-opt the religious powers to justify their policies and their actions. Religious powers have sought, on their hand, sought to shape civil powers and bring to them a moral compass. And of course, those interactions have been very complex over history. However, it seems to me that we're now living in a significantly different time to previous times. And I've sometimes thought of it as perhaps being a new axial age, another turning of the wheel. According to sociologists such as David Voas in Britain, and Jörg Stolz in Switzerland, Ryan Cragen in the USA, amongst others, we're now in a period of world secularization. The process of decline in religion has been measured in almost every country around the globe. They argue that the process has 3 steps in it. But first of all, people attend religious institutions less frequently. People feel less positive about religion in general as a second step. And the third step is that people cease to identify with a religion and it fades as something no longer in people's radars. Many African nations are just at the first stage, with some measures throughout the continent now of decline in attendance. In Australia and many Anglo countries, we're at the stage where only half of the population identify with a religion. And that process, it seems to be rapidly developing. It's been suggested by some of the sociologists that the total process is likely to take about 200 years and depends on the process of modernisation. There's 2 particular drivers that I want to mention of this process. The first is that new knowledge over this, particularly as it's developed over the past 200 years, has developed distinct realms of knowledge with their own specialists. In other words, there's been a differentiation in knowledge, with economics, science, psychology, biology, all developing in ways which leave little place within them for religion. The corresponding process has occurred within the institutions within which those distinct realms of knowledge work. Gradually, religion is pushed out of those particular spheres of society. And in a few moments, I'm going to ask Diane Su to talk about her research in Thailand. And while she has found this process of secularisation occurring, and some of these processes, in fact, can be seen in Thailand, she's also found some aspects of religious faith that that are resilient. I'll let her explain that. But there are other drivers which can speed or inhibit the process of secularisation, and amongst these is the level of trust or confidence that members of society have in religious institutions. The level of that level of trust or confidence has to do with the ways in which religious institutions behave. And part of that is whether they are measuring up to their own moral codes. I've analysed some of the data on levels of confidence in religious institutions in Australia in the volume 7 of the Journal of Contemporary Ministry. There's copies down there. But Leonie is going to speak in a few minutes about the issue of sexual abuse and what that's meant for the relationship between religion and society in Australia. But there is another side to the story altogether, for religious institutions are continuing to provide great resources. At the local level, there can be high levels of trust. And Fleur Creed will be speaking about the positive impact of churches in their local areas through some of the work that they do in welfare. Stephen Reid will be speaking about the influence of chaplains working in the sporting arena. Fleur and Stephen will both give us some clues, I think, as to why particular forms of ministry are effective in an age in which religious faith has been fading. Anyway, if you want to explore the topics in greater depth, certainly there's the copy of the Journal of Contemporary Ministry, and we've, over the last 3 editions, available in print, but they're also available free as PDFs online, so you don't have to purchase one. Later this afternoon, we'll have another major example of how religious organisations are continuing to have a positive influence on society through motivating and engaging volunteers. And one of the tasks that I've been involved in has been seeking to provide the basis for doing some economic measurement of the impact of religion in that area. And Keith Thompson will be introducing his book, which I've contributed to. We've both worked on together in some, in certain ways, that looks at some of the results from that study. So let me first of all introduce Diane Su, and she's there, and ready to speak. Let me just say a word or two before I hand over to you, Diane. Diane is a Victorian, but she's currently working in Thailand. She's been a nurse, a social worker, a farmer, but for more than 10 years she's been working in northeast Thailand, assisting with church planting and working with women as a missionary of the Australian Christian churches. She's been watching the rapid changes occurring in Thai society and reflecting on what this means for the religious roles of women. Diane, I invite you to speak to us. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Philip, and everyone else. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Philip said, my husband and I have volunteered as field workers for Australian Christian Churches International for 10 years in northeast Thailand in an area known as Isan, where 0.02% of the population are Christian. My research focused on the changing socio-religious roles of women in response to the influence of urbanisation, globalisation and industrialisation, processes presumed associated with secularisation in Western settings. These processes have rapidly changed Thailand society, and many aspects of Thai society have developed outside the parameters of religious jurisdiction. In response, the role of women in society has broadened considerably, altering traditional religious behaviours of women. In Isan society, there is no separation or division between the material and spiritual aspects of life, or between religion and society. Buddhism is followed by over 92.5% of the population. The three main principles of Buddhism are a belief in karma, the law of cause and effect, rebirth or being reborn into different lives, and the impermanence of everything. Buddha endeavoured to teach a way out of suffering in daily life, and for the Thai people, that is to gain merit by doing good to offset bad karma. Religion in Isan is a shared community experience rather than an individual exercise. Buddhist women base their religiosity on the frequency of merit making, going to the temple and giving alms to the monks. The more action she performs, the more religious a woman is seen to be. Here, animism underlies Buddhism, which involves the belief in spirits that inhabit every part of the universe, including the spirits of deceased ancestors coexisting with the living. These spirits are believed to have a powerful impact on their fortunes and health. Animism provides people with ways of dealing with calamity and sickness and unexpected misfortunes through the performance of ritual offerings and ceremonies. Research established that modernisation is having an impact, leading to transformation and modification in the role that religion plays in the everyday lives of women. Women are more highly educated and independent than previous generations of women, though the attitudes and beliefs that the women traditionally held regarding karma, merit making, and ancestors being a part of their lives has persisted. The research found that institutional forms of Buddhism was losing ground in the lives of urban women. Village women, who are generally of an older age group, were more traditional in their outlook and practices. Some animistic rituals and traditions were fading out of use in villages due to the modernisation of health, agriculture and education sectors in Isan. The research concluded that urbanised women are less likely to attend the temple daily, with less overall reliance on monks and traditional doctors. Women had less time to engage in spiritual practices. Previously, most ceremonies and rituals were conducted publicly in association with other relatives and friends in the village in the presence of monks. Today, for urban women, these practices, when they are performed, are done individually at home when time permits. The social ideals for adult women are changing. Instead of being a good wife, mother and daughter as previously, now getting a good job and being financially successful is more respected. Social status is dependent on educational levels, employment profession, economic spending power, and the amount of money one has. There is an immense generation gap between different age groups of women, leading to different religious viewpoints. Good works is still the main focus of merit making for educated women by visiting hospitals, schools, and giving to the poor. For the village women, frequent temple going and alms giving in the form of food or money or personal items remained essential. Young women are looking for other ways of engagement, watching chanting on YouTube, having fortune teller apps and wallpapers on their phone, doing personal meditation and living healthy lifestyles. Many do not go to the temple unless it's a special occasion. They search the internet and ask friends for spiritual advice. They are not interested in having spirit houses on their properties, as some of the older generation are, nor are ancestor shelves utilised by young women. Some forms of secularization were noted, especially in this group, who are more concerned with material than spiritual matters. Rituals remain important to older women, no matter how highly educated they were, especially rituals concerning family members who have passed away. Animism, which predates Buddhism in Islam, gives women a sense of power and control in everyday life and continues to have significant importance to women. Magic is another area where women often seek help with everyday problems and issues by seeking out fortune tellers, palm readers, lotteries, or tarot card readers. In Islam, religion maintains a positive influence on society. Culture and religion cannot be easily separated as in Western culture. Buddhism performs a different role in society compared to Christianity in the West. Buddhism encourages good behaviour and helps maintain strong community relationships, as it sets the moral behaviour code for all relationships in society. Its belief system helps people come to terms with bad luck in life, and it helps people to accept things that are seemingly beyond their control, giving believers a sense of order in the universe. Karma gives an explanation of why things happen in the world to good and bad people alike for the Buddhist. Technology in the form of social media and phone apps is being utilised to engage women's spiritual selves at convenient times. Overall, due to the pragmatic nature of Islam women, new technologies and sciences were embraced if these entities were found to perform better than traditional ways. This has led to a decline in some animistic and traditional ways of interacting with life. So what does this mean for cross-cultural ministry? So contextualization of the gospel message into the Islam women's worldview is necessary so that Islam women can grasp the true meaning of the gospel for themselves and develop their own practices, rituals, and theology as they form a relationship with Jesus Christ. Field workers must be submerged in the new culture and form meaningful relationships before attempting to bring a message. Indigenous churches need to develop their own culturally appropriate ways of being Christian, rather than importing westernized ways that just do not fit well into the Islam worldview. Women engage in practices that they believe will give them power in their day-to-day lives in times of uncertainty or crises. Magico-animistic practices are a power play to bring good luck, prosperity, or health to women. If Christianity is going to bear on that power play, then the Christianity expounded needs to be a powerful gospel through the work and demonstration of the Holy Spirit. Western theology, without the power of the Holy Spirit and signs and wonders, will not take root in an animistic culture. Their power and influence are their undergirding philosophies. Education did not greatly impact deeply held beliefs.
Thanks, Diane. Leonie has spent much of her life working as a barrister, and she's very familiar with the Victorian courts and the cases that come there, and has been particularly concerned about the cases of child abuse. She's also an Anglican who is deeply committed to her faith and has taken many roles in various Anglican parishes and in the Synod. I've been working with her now, I think, for 9 years, as she has been looking at the changes in law that have arisen from the child abuse cases and what these changes mean for the churches. And I'm going to invite Leonie now to speak. Thanks, Leonie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to pay my respect and thanks to Christian Research Association for providing me with the opportunity to speak to you today. What I'm highlighting today as part of a general theme is that there has been a transformation in the church-state relationship. And I'll be examining that very briefly. and then leading on to an analysis of the parable of the Good Samaritan, since that parable is very closely associated with the formation of the modern law of negligence. And I'll also be looking at the roles of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse and the Victorian Betrayal of Trust inquiry. Religious organisations have played an enormous role in Australia, providing social welfare, healthcare, aged care and education. In fact, that landscape would hardly be full or fulfilled without the role of religious organisations. All of those organisations have held a special privileged role in the life of our nation, and accordingly, by and large, they've been allowed to regulate their own internal affairs without state interference. That has now changed. There has been a transformation in the church-state relationship, and it's been marked by three significant events. First, in 2012, the Victorian Parliament conducted an inquiry into the handling of child abuse by religious and other non-government organisations, and produced subsequent to that what is now known as the Betrayal of Trust report that was handed down in November 2013. Second, as you are well aware, there was the appointment of the Commonwealth Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and that report from the Commission was handed down in December 2017. Consequent upon those two state secular inquiries, particularly in each state, there has been a suite of legal reforms following on from the recommendations and the reports and the research coming from those reports. These laws have involved an unprecedented state intervention in the internal affairs of religious organisations. It's an international phenomenon. It's something in Australia we are certainly not used to. The Victorian legislative changes have been broad-ranging and numerous. They include changes to the Limitation of Actions Act, changes to the Crimes Act, and an amendment to the Wrongs Act, which established what is now known as organisational liability for child sexual abuse. I turn now briefly to the creation of the modern law of negligence and its relationship to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Not so distant from each other. To put it briefly and to summarise, the parable illustrates the exclusion of outsiders from the call to Israel to care for suffering strangers. It established the role of a marginalised outsider Samaritan, and it established the role of a wounded, unknown victim who was both a stranger and marginalised to the nation of Israel. It is this idea of stranger marginalisation that in fact resonates today. The parable contrasts the response of Jewish leaders to a wounded stranger and then the response of the despised Samaritan outsider. It introduces this idea of an unexpected outsider. And included in the narrative of that parable is what we now know as the Great Commandment that links a seamless ethical obligation of love of God to love of neighbour. How is it associated with the modern law of negligence? In 1932, in a landmark case, some of you would already know, called Donoghue and Stevenson, Lord Atkin, in his judgment in this case, said, and I quote, "Acts or omissions which any moral code would censure cannot in the practical world be treated to give a right to every person who's injured. The rule that you are to love your neighbour becomes in law you must not injure your neighbour. And the lawyer's question is, who is my neighbour? Atkins says it receives a restricted reply. You must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee that would likely injure your neighbour. Now, since 1932, the law of negligence has expanded and developed from this fundamental principle. But you can see from this judgment that there is a clear distinction between the ethical standards derived from the parable, which command love of neighbour, and the legal duty of care that requires that you do not harm your neighbour. One critical issue in the parable is the legal limits placed on the love of neighbour command. In contemporary Jewish society, at the time the parable is mentioned in the Gospel, the love of neighbour in fact meant love that was limited to the priests, Levites, and the true members of Israel. It excluded the outside stranger and excluded the outsider Samaritan. I've argued that there's a comparison between the Levite and the priests who passed by the wounded stranger, and that mirrors some responses by some faith-based organisations in relation to child sexual abuse claims. Such victims were treated as outsiders of diminished importance compared to the reputation of churches and individual clergy. In terms of the parable, it is the secular investigations conducted by the Royal Commission and the Victorian Betrayal and Trust Inquiry that constitute the secular caring outsiders to churches. State-sponsored inquiries conducted an exercise of monumental pastoral care listening to the voices of child sex abuse victims, whom religious organisations at that time had passed by. And there are parallels between the parable and the previous responses to the reporting of child sexual abuse by religious organisations. They're examined in more detail in the article in the current issue of the Journal of Contemporary Ministry. The wounded stranger of the parable is a silent victim. Similarly, the silence of victims of child sexual abuse and their associated shame are similarly silenced. The priest and the Levite see the alienated, wounded victim but pass them by. My submission to you is that the secular state organisations, namely the Royal Commission and the Victorian Inquiry, are the outsiders to Australian churches, but they're the ones that have been as outsiders that demonstrate compassion and listen to the silent victims. Martin Percy states, "The most striking feature, as always, is the inability of the church to listen, to see, to feel. The Royal Commission listened, it has seen, it has felt, and has noted those things that for years were hiding in plain sight." The recommendations of the Royal Commission and the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry are the driving force behind the Victorian statutory reforms, and I won't go into detail about that. You don't need to hear me all from a lawyer this afternoon. But what I do say is that there has been a transformation in the church-state relationship. A theological reflection of the Australian church needs to read the sign of the times, and some of those signs have already been beautifully articulated by Philip this afternoon. My general proposition is the outsider status of the Royal Commission and the Victorian Betrayal and Trust Inquiry mirrors the outsider status of the Samaritan. Secular outsiders that assisted who had been left by the wayside, similar to the actions of the priest and the Levite in the parable. But the parable calls Australian churches and religious organisations to a higher ethical standard in fully hearing those who have been abused and damaged. Churches are now more strongly ethically bound to provide not only spiritual, psychological and physical, but as well as financial healing. Indeed, the ethical responsibility of Australian churches is not just the avoidance of further damage, but the building of child-safe environments through which children will find the fullness of life offered by the gospel. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonie. There's a huge challenges within that for the churches. Fleur Creed is going to speak about the potential impact of welfare in local churches in building community. Fleur has had a varied career, from fashion to counselling in many different contexts, and most recently in research. But she has been looking at the welfare programs of local churches of different denominations and the ways in which they've been able to build a sense of community in their various local contexts. Thank you, Fleur.
Thank you, Philip. I have my PhD topic was on local churches building community in their local contexts. And since then, I've continued to research in this topic. We've heard from Philip of the declining attendance figures in churches, and also about the lack of understanding of many in the wider community of the value of the local church. Few would argue that Jesus would have us care for the poor and needy, in whatever form that may take. However, for various reasons, social welfare is something that some churches no longer engage in. Although, as Leonie's told us, the Bible advises us all to love our neighbours. I'd like to propose that the benefits of social welfare and other social engagement in the community by churches far outweighs any difficulties that they may encounter in doing that. Firstly, and most obviously, we're addressing the needs of the disadvantaged, and that may be disadvantage of any type. They may not meet the criteria of the programs offered by other services and organisations. We all know that there are, in most of our city areas or regional areas, there may be NGOs or community organisations that do offer services to those people, but quite often they have very strict criteria. Churches can often provide some of the services that might be able to be offered, but they will offer them as a Christian ministry. They would be flexible and they will not be restricted because somebody doesn't fit the right criteria. Secondly, offering social welfare builds much needed social capital in communities. It builds social capital between volunteers and community members, and amongst the church and other organisations. Social capital can be called a fuzzy concept, but really in layman's terms, social relations may generate positive benefits. One of the fathers of social capital, Pierre Bourdieu, said, "It's not what you know, but who you know that matters." These different networks of relationships form different types of social capital. Bonding social capital is between closer individuals, ones who are more similar in personal characteristics and have more frequent multiplex interactions, providing support and nurture. Bonding social capital generates thick trust and is needed to get by in life. That can be family members or close people in a group, maybe in a cell group at church, or just people you know very well, you do a lot of things with. Bridging social capital refers to the ties with those who you know less well. It's more outward looking, towards people in different groups or communities, generating thin trust. It helps you to get ahead. Bridging capital helps with sharing information and access to resources. Linking capital refers to the type of networks formed between individuals and groups at different levels of power and influence, and it may assist those of lower power status to change their situation. All of these types of capital, social capital, help people in the community, both those within the church and those outside the church. So you can imagine these networks are very beneficial in the wider community. Contacts between church members and volunteers offer the opportunity to engage in a variety of activities and relationships, building networks that strengthen all the community. Research tells us that social capital has a positive effect on child development, adolescent well-being, improved mental health, lower crime rates, reduced mortality, lower susceptibility to depression and to loneliness, higher perceptions of well-being, and also self-rated health. Working with others also gives us the opportunity to experience what is known as receptive generosity, which allows us to not only give, but receive from the other. This is suggested that the giver resists the notion of being a giver only, which is what happens when we give charity, but be prepared to actively receive from the vulnerable other. Cole says receptive generosity is a matter of actively cultivating the uncomfortable openness to the ways and thinking of others, cultivating receptivity to unlearning the privileges of historical power and the knowledge presumptions that go with it. That is why charity is quite different. With charity, we put ourselves above the other. We just give. But with receptive generosity, we acknowledge that even someone who is in need can give to us too. We receive, we learn something from someone in need. Whatever the form of reciprocity, it's a characteristic of the social exchanges which constitute social capital. Offering social welfare provides both the church as an organisation and the individuals that comprise it the opportunity to be Jesus to the needs of the local community, also building social capital between volunteers and community members, strengthening the community and improving outcomes for individuals. Now, I've concentrated on social welfare because that's something that is well known with churches. Doing things like, in my research, I looked at homeless lunches, people who provided housing services, all sorts of different true welfare services. But there are also others who did things like had craft groups, men's, different things like that, gardening clubs. But they actually served the same purpose because quite often there were people who were lonely or maybe lived, they had a very sick partner or something to that effect. And by attending those groups, they met exactly these same needs. They were disadvantaged or needy people who were the poor, the marginalised in some way. And they were building these bridging networks, and those needs were being satisfied. In some cases, they did build bonding capital with others like them. In other cases, they learnt about other people. Some of the people that I interviewed who went along from the church, they were building bridging networks with people who were so unlike them, but they learnt about other people's way of life. So it was very important. And so it isn't just about providing a hot meal for someone who's starving. It can be doing anything with the wider community to build relationships. Thank you.
Thank you, Fleur. And there's a lot of practical advice in the research that she has done for churches in the ways in which they do their welfare work. Stephen has been involved in the Christian Research Association for about 16 or 17 years, I think it is now. He's a skilled researcher at home, both with large surveys and statistical analysis, and with interviews and with analysing them. He's also a long-distance runner, and his doctoral thesis combined his interest in sport with his commitment to the Christian faith and to research. And the result was a thesis focused on the impact of chaplaincy in our increasingly secular society. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Hello again. Well, it could be argued that Australians have a passionate obsession with sport, reflected certainly through our history, and you can see it continue through society today. There continues to be a significant decline in religious activities and beliefs, as well as negatively changing attitudes towards Christianity. However, over recent years, there's been an increased demand from sporting clubs for Christian chaplains. In my doctoral research investigating the roles and functions of sports chaplains in contemporary Australian society, some of the questions I really wanted to explore involved understanding the major dimension of a chaplain's role and what that looked like across different sports, in different locations, and in different levels of sporting here in Australia. But in addition to that, I also wanted to explore what local churches and the broader denominational organisations could learn from the Ministry of Sports Chaplaincy in relation to engaging with society. My research identified 4 major dimensions to a chaplain's role, sports chaplain's role, and this is spelled out once again in more detail in the Journal of Contemporary Ministry. But briefly, there's 4 dimensions. The firstly, chaplains saw themselves as involved in the mission of God. That is, they sensed that they were called by God to provide a Christian presence and care within a sporting club. Now, that looked very different depending on the context, depending on the sport, the location, of course, and of course the chaplains themselves. But for most chaplains, their role was not to be an evangelist nor a Bible basher, or to push their religion or their views onto others. In fact, many felt that their acceptance would be in jeopardy if they did cross that line. Most chaplains saw their role as involving a sense of purpose and a sense of presence in the name of God, rather than being overly or overtly evangelistic in that sense. Second dimension, chaplains most generally understood their role as a ministry of the local church or parish community. However, there were different perceptions of how the ministry of the church should be fulfilled. Many in the churches believed that fulfilment of that is only seen as effective through being present at worship services on a weekend. That was the measure of effectiveness for them. Well, the fact that someone is helped through perhaps experiences of trauma or grief or relationship issues was considered less effective, particularly if the former, the attendance at worship services, was not occurring. So I very much sensed there were very different perceptions from churches compared to the chaplains, even significant tensions in some circumstances. The third dimension of the chaplain's role related to their contribution in the provision of pastoral care. And that was expressed in different ways depending on the sport environment and the chaplains themselves. But most commonly that was built through building relationships of trust, being available for care if that was needed to those in the clubs. But it also, interestingly, involved spiritual care of individuals, even if an individual did not necessarily see themselves as spiritual or religious. The final dimension of the chaplain's role was what I called the prophetic aspect. Now, by prophetic here, I mean that the chaplain had a role to play in having a transformational effect on the sporting community. So chaplains provide quite a significant benefit to sporting clubs by building or contributing to positive values and a sense of justice and integrity, as well as contributing to club morale and culture. The number of people in the clubs that I talked to who said the chaplain had a significant effect on the culture of the club was quite quite powerful. Every second person I spoke to would have something to say about that. Now, the language that we may use as Christians or out in church or parish land is being able to point to the transforming message of Jesus by simply being there and genuinely, underscore genuinely, caring for others in our immediate context. So what I discovered through my research was that at their best, sports chaplains are culture brokers, a term, I believe, coined by practical theologian John Swinton. That is, in this context, culture brokers are those who bridge a gap between the two very different cultures of sport and church. And why is a culture broker important anyway? Because I think, as perhaps my research identified, that chaplains can provide a link between the two vital communities, the local church and the local sporting club. Occasionally, there may already be links there. There is already links there in many contexts, but often they can be quite tenuous as well. Now, I'm not saying that sports chaplains are the only culture brokers that are influencing society for the better. Christian culture brokers are already doing work on the streets, in the hospitals, in the prisons, in the schools, in the shopping centres, in homes and in families. In fact, one could argue that wherever and whenever Jesus' message is proclaimed in deed or in word, a culture broker could be there. Missiologist Leslie Newbigin, in discussing the relationship between the gospel, which bears witness to the kingdom, the reign and sovereignty of God, and contemporary Western culture, appeals to the church broadly speaking, that is, not to call women and men out of the world into a safe religious enclave, but rather to call them out in order to send them back as agents of God's kingdom. I remember reading a Vatican document from a few years ago. It said, it's about sport and the church, it said, the church is at home in sport, and sport is at home in the church, or at least it should be. So to put it another way, the work of the church, that is us individuals living out the gospel in our own lives, is in the world. It's not behind the four walls of the church building with the doors sort of closing behind us every time we enter. It is, I believe, in the town square, in the workplace, in the shopping centre, in the schools, in the park, and in the sporting club. I concluded my thesis with the words that I believe, I hope will remain true for some time to come. Through the Ministry of Sports Chaplaincy, Christianity in Australia has an opportunity to provide a genuine and influential gospel-centric ministry in society and grow the kingdom of God outside the four walls of the church building. And I think if the church is to be, or to again become, a credible and valued institution in Australian society, there has to be an obligation for it to take its ministries from the four walls of its internal and its inward focused structures out into the everyday world in which its members live. Churches can use, I believe, one model of that is sports chaplaincy, to ensure their own mission is outward focused and gospel centric as it seeks to influence society for the better. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you to each of the speakers. In asking for those articles, I was asking for them to summarise about 8 years' work in one little article, and then today I've asked them to summarise that the article down to another 5 or 10 minutes. So So it's a very distilled version that you've got. The longer version is in the journal, as I've said. But I'm very grateful to each of those people for the way that they've presented the essence of their work over many years. So thank you. We've got time for just one or two questions before we move to the next part of the afternoon. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask, not just me, but any of the four people? Yes, Philip.
Just a comment on Stephen speaking about chaplains. The Anglican Church decided not to defund hospital chaplains last year.
Not to defund them. To defund them.
Yes. Well, stop them. I
Really?
would have thought in the hospital setting a chaplain would have been particularly useful, but the Anglican Church hasn't done it.
That's interesting. Yes, John.
I'd like to ask Leonie a question. Clearly, she's posed, and I think very beautifully simplified, the issue regarding church-state relationships coming out of the whole child abuse fiasco, for put it that way. How are churches generally managing?
Thank you for that question. I think with great difficulty, because what is being challenged is the culture of each parish and the culture of each church. There is a great push in leadership to introduce further safe ministry protocols, to introduce all the things that we need to do in order to make child-safe environments. But that's not easy when you have an organisation or individual parishes that have never had to be regulated in any way that now is happening. And if you're in a position in a parish, you will have found you will be asked to get a working with children card check, you will be asked to get a CRIM check, and I know in the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, we have to set out the details of everyone in a position of authority, the dates of those things. There are 2 or 3 levels of safe ministry training that are required. That's a huge change in culture, and I think it places a huge burden on vicars and rectors. It has a huge burden on those who are working within each parish. It's a very changed landscape. I know of some people that just refuse point blank. I don't need to do these things. The fact of the problem is this is now a matter of law, but it's a huge struggle for people, and it's at the coalface of parishes. It's not at the headquarters of the diocese, it's the coalface of parishes, and that is where I think some people are struggling. Does that help?
Can I ask a quick follow-on question?
Yes.
Do you think it would be, I mean, obviously it's a financial question and some places don't have the finances, right? Do you think there would be value in having paid specialists deliver that training rather than vicars? Because my experience of doing that training in the Melbourne Diocese has been that if I didn't already have that training from elsewhere, what the diocese provided would be next year.
I can only speak for the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne. There are compulsory online training units, and clearly there is a program now of people who are providing online training that can be provided personally. That is paid. I understand exactly what you're saying, because you are caught between that tension of volunteer organisation and paid professional. And because the difficulties of trying to get the level of child-safe education to the point where you are effectively protecting your community is a huge challenge. I can see exactly the problem that you're confronted with. And the problem, I think, for all organisations is that child predators are highly intelligent, extremely manipulative, and they have time on their side. And it is now known that these predators will not only train or groom victims, but the phenomena of grooming the organisation is very clear, and that has been documented by the Royal Commission. Now, this places enormous social pressure on people. There is in the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne a hierarchy of who's responsible to whom. So it used to be the vicar, which is almost an impossible burden, particularly if you're full-time parish ministry. But now there is an appointment of a child safe officer in each parish. You've got to get those people though. I mean, all of us are resource poor, aren't we? To a great extent. And some parishes are rich in human resources, but other parishes are not, and they struggle to comply even with the basic day-to-day running. I think it's one of the major challenges that all organisations are going to be confronted with. Does that help?
Very good.
Thank you, Leonie.